Ephesians 5, verse 25 and 28. I'm going to just do those two verses just for the sake of time. But before we get there, I want to read this from the Song of Solomon, where Solomon says in chapter 5, verse 2, I slept, but my heart was awake as sound. My beloved is knocking. Open to me, my sister, my love. You see, it's very intuitive. If we hear a knock on the door, we don't open the door immediately. Usually we would ask who's there. And if there's a stranger, we are pretty reluctant to open the door. We might have some questions to ask and ask, what are the intentions for knocking on your door? But if it's somebody we know, and especially somebody who we love, it's intuitive for us to just open the door and invite them in, showing them love, kindness, and hospitality. That's very straightforward and very natural for us. But when it comes to marriage, it's somehow that we have a knock on the door of our hearts, and we don't always open up. We hold back, and we resist sharing and showing love to even our beloved. The things that Jesus taught, indeed, were countercultural, counterintuitive. Things were just not natural. It's not, that doesn't make sense. I'll give you an example of that. Matthew 16:25. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. That does not make sense. That is counterintuitive. That is the exact opposite of what I would think. How about this? Matthew 20:16. So the last will be first and the first will be last. That is not what culture will tell us, right? Especially if you're out at Disneyland and you like way back in the line there, right? And you're like, this is not going to work. Okay, you there in the back, you come up front here. That's not how it's going to work here. But, everything that Jesus teaches is indeed counterintuitive and maybe even a little bit countercultural. It does not come natural for us. Whoever exalts himself shall be humbled, and whoever humbles himself shall be exalted. So, inadvertently, in these counterintuitive thoughts, there is a blessing. If we are willing to humble ourselves, we will be blessed by being exalted by Him. Inadvertently, if we look at Ephesians 5:25 and verse 28, we will see something there about the husband's love for his wife that seems, this is kind of counterintuitive, because in one way or another, he is opening up the door for blessing himself by loving his wife. And that doesn't seem to make sense. Let's read this. Let's read it, verse 25. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her. Now let's jump over to verse 28. So husbands ought also to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his own wife loves himself. He who loves his wife loves himself. That doesn't make sense. But I will show you. In the bigger scheme of things, it does make sense, at least in God's eyes. Before you and I do anything for anybody, we often ask ourselves, okay, what's in it for me? Right? What am I going to get out of it? Men, you're going to get a lot out of it if you apply verse 25. It does not sound natural. It's not instinctive. Your natural response will not be to love her and thinking that you're actually loving yourself. What am I saying here today? Am I going to tell you guys, if you love your wife in the same way that you love yourselves, you will be actually loving yourself? Huh? That doesn't make sense. Well, let's go on. I'm going to show you something here today about the character of a husband's love for his wife. The character of a husband's wife for his wife. The proportion of a husband's love for his wife, and the blessings of a husband's love for his wife. And that I'm going to base on verses 25 and 28. And as I said, I'm going to just do this for brevity's sake. But you see, everything here in verse 25 and 28 goes against our natural inclinations, because we are so naturally inclined to love ourselves. We give love to ourselves. We make that a priority. But here's three strange and counterintuitive ways in which a husband's love works out in such a way that he actually blesses himself. The first thing is, and this is based on the character of a husband's love, his love gives. Number one, his love gives. Look at verse 25. It speaks there of a husband's love for his wife is to be like the love Christ has for his church. How? By giving himself up for her. The character of this type of love is, it's a agape type of love. You see, agape love is the type of love that transcends circumstances. It rises above feelings and emotions. Agape love is a proactive type of love. It's not a reactive type of love. It chooses to love first. But it is also the type of love that has determination. It is determined to love someone in a certain way, just as Christ is determined to love his church. You see, a husband's love is like Christ's love. It does not fluctuate. It's not like the weather in North Dakota. In certain days we can have 20 below zero, and later that day we have 30 above zero. It's bizarre. No. Agape love is a steady type of love. It is a giving type of love. In this verse, it speaks of Christ's love for the church, which was demonstrated and manifested in him giving himself for her. Now notice there, it says there that Christ gave himself up for her. It doesn't say that Christ gave a portion or gave of himself, but he gave himself in its entirety to the church as a sacrifice. This means, husbands, your love is to be like that of Christ's. It is not a type of love that you give a portion or a ration of yourself. It's not making a sacrifice, but it is, in a sense, sacrificing yourself for her. John 3:16, for God so loved the world. How did God love the world? He gave. He gave his only begotten Son. That is how God's love works. It is a giving, it's a sacrificial type of love. Likewise, a husband's love is a gospel-centered type of love. It is a type of love that gives, even while we were yet sinners, Christ died for the ungodly. It is a type of love that is certainly undeserved. If you look back there at verse 2 in Ephesians 5, and walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. To love here in verse 25 is To you Greek buffs here, people who like studying biblical Greek, it is an imperative. Present active imperative. That simply means it's a command. You must. God is saying, husbands, you must love your wife in this agape type of way. And when and how? Always. Always. It's not an option, and it doesn't fluctuate. David Ricucci, in his book on marriage, says, although a Christian man is called to love everyone, clearly he is to love his wife as no other. No one on earth should experience more of my generosity, respect, kindness, and sacrifice and gratitude than my wife. That's from Love That Lasts. I highly recommend that book. What does it mean to give in a sacrificial way love to our wives, husbands? I'm going to distill this in a very simple ritual my wife and I have. There was a store that opened up, a grocery store in Grand Forks, North Dakota. It's called Aldi. That's like, wow, Aldi came to North Dakota. Time for celebration. And you know, we love it because they got all these German products. And they got a little wafer there. It's a chocolate wafer called a Knopper. Okay, go find it there. It's really cool. It's a little chocolate wafer about 1.5 inches square. It's delicious. And I would get us some of those, and I would bring it home. And my little ritual after a hard day of work is to enjoy one of those after dinner. And so it is that my wife can hear that wrapper unfolding. She could be tuned in to something on TV, listen to my daughter complain about school, and then still hear the wrapper unfolding. It is that moment that when the last wafer is unfolded that my wife would say, "Are you going to give me a bite from that?" I got to do these things more covertly. Go down into the basement and unwrap it there. But I'm a good husband. I am. I actually share with her. So what I would do is I will take out one of our knives, the sharpest one, because I don't want that thing to crumble. And I would measure it, cut it in half. Here's equity. I'm a good husband. And then I would notice that I'm about 1/16 of an inch off. And I will give her the smaller portion. That's how it works. Why? Not because I'm a good husband and I'm sharing. If I was a good husband, I would give the whole wafer to her. That's what it means to be loving our wives in a sacrificial way. But you see, I love myself, and I will give myself the bigger portion. And that's the other part of this passage that we must clue into. And this is the proportions and dimensions of a husband's love. And I titled this, "His love is same as ... Look at verse 28. So a husband ought to also love their wives as their own bodies. You got to love your wife just as you love your own body. My body is fueled by chocolate wafers made in Germany. Is there Aldi's nearby here? Okay, good. You see, what Paul is talking about is a husband's care and love and affection for his wife needs to be to the same proportions and degree that he cares for his own body. A husband's service to his wife is to be in the same degree and proportion as his service to himself. His attentiveness to his wife's needs needs to be in the same proportion as the attentiveness to himself. And whether we like to admit it, husbands, we do like to treat ourselves. And we go buy ourselves often the best that's out there. I'm not sure who of you go to In-N-Out here. I mean, that's yeah. And, sometimes you go, hey, we're just going to kind of save some money here. Just get like a basic burger. Don't double it, just a basic. Get some water. We can put a lemon in there. We want to save money. And then you go pick up the order and you got a milkshake. Right? And she's like, what about me? And you're like, I just needed some protein. Right? But there's something to be said here, verse 28 here, that we do seem to take very good care of ourselves as men. And what it's saying here is it's not that you don't love yourself, husband. The Bible assumes we do love ourselves a lot. We got to just do the same for our wives. Either the same or better, in equal proportions or better. So in the way you care and love, feed, and nurture and pamper and treat yourselves, husbands, you got to have that same standard or better for your wife. The husband is to love his wife in the same way, equal or better, than he loves his own body. The husband's attentiveness to his own comforts are to be translated equal or greater for his wife. And you might find this after a long and tiring day. We want to go home and just kick back, right? Whether it's just sitting back in the recliner, watching TV. I don't know what you guys do out here. But after a hard day's work, I just want to have a cup of tea, unwrap one of my favorite German chocolate wafers, uninterrupted, unshared, and kick back. And I don't want to be bothered. But what about my wife? What if she has had a hard day? She too wants a cup of tea, a German chocolate wafer, kick back in the recliner, and maybe even turn on the TV and not be bothered. And so at times that I go pamper myself, my wife has this saying, she's good at idioms, she would say to me, am I just chopped liver? And I'm like, what does that mean? Well, it just means, am I just like nobody here? How about attending to me? And that's her cue to me, that if she's chopped liver, and is that what we say in South Africa? No, Charles, maybe not. He was sophisticated. I was just more running around there on the savannah. But there, chopped liver is just like, yeah, that's the scraps. That's not the steak and the filet mignons. And so for my wife, if I can pamper myself with a cup of tea and a chocolate and a recliner, why wouldn't I do that for my wife? Well, simply because I love myself more and I prioritize myself more. But this is where things flip around. If you do pamper her and you do unwrap a little wafer for her and you give her a cup of tea, somehow you are doing the same for yourself. That's where it just kind of warps our thinking. You see, we as husbands, we are to serve and care and attend and nurture our wives in the very ways that we like to be cared for, served, and attended to and nurtured. And this is at all levels, emotional, physical, and even the spiritual areas of life. You see, if we serve her, we are actually serving ourselves. If we are pampering her, we actually pampering her, or ourselves rather. He who loves his wife loves himself. Let that sink in, brothers. He who loves his wife loves himself. Verse 28. His love for her is loving himself. And that's the third takeaway here. Your love for her is loving yourself. If a husband loves his wife, he is actually loving himself. And that is somewhat hard to understand because it's just so unnatural. It is not our natural reflex to think in that way. But here's a clue. Paul clues us into why we should think this way, husbands. Look at verse 31 there. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And I'm like, okay, now this makes sense. Now this makes sense. This one flesh union is what makes this loving her is loving self. That makes sense. Back in South Africa, we did this premarital class with our pastor, Joel James. Did you guys do it with Pastor Joel James? Yeah. And I looked in it, and he's got a thing there called She Is He. And I thought, that's cool, but that's cool for like 2006. You know. I'm like, this is really cool, but you can't say she is he, but he's got a title there in his premarital counseling, she is he. And I'm like, yeah, that's not going to work today. But really, it is like if you make your wife a priority, you're making you a priority. If you attend to her, you're attending to yourself. Serving her actually turns into a blessing for yourselves, husbands. Caring for her is actually caring for yourself. Whatever you two do to nourish her soul, it turns around and actually blesses your own soul, and you are nourished. How does that work? Well, it works because it's this one flesh union, and I think this is Matthew Henry who said the following. He says, "It is because the rib God took out has been reinserted in the form of a person, and they are now one person." That's sweet, right? The rib God took out has been reinserted in the form of a person. And that's how we are to think, dear husbands. Husbands, you are to look at your wife not as this complete separate entity on her own island, running her own government, but rather she is something that has been taken out and reinserted in the form of a person. So if we go back to this concept of sacrifice, well, if I take time, if I sacrifice some of my time for her and for her benefit, what you are doing is you're not losing. You're actually gaining. You're actually gaining double dividends. You see, whatever time, effort, and energies you sacrifice for your wife, you're actually adding it back to yourself. And I'll give you just a practical example of that. When summer hits, somewhere in May up there in North Dakota, I remember last year summer was on a Wednesday, but the days are long there, and the sun goes down like 10:30, 11, right? So days are long, but after work, I just want to go fish. I just want to go fish. And my wife's like, where are you going? He says, just sit down a little bit and chat. I want to hear how your day is. Honey, summer's running out. We got to get the fish. And then she says, you'll have time to go fish. Just spend a little bit of time with me. And I'm like, okay. And then we chat. And then 9 out of 10 times, my fishing's great. But there's times that I'm like, okay, I got to get home. She's going to be out. She's going to be at the gym. And if I calculate this right, I can spend at least another 5 hours fishing. And usually I come home. And, how was it? No, wasn't good. There is something to be said that there is no amount of sacrifice of time, resources, energy, whatever, that we invest in our wives that can ever possibly be a divestment from yourself. The actual opposite is true. My pastor back in South Africa, Pastor Joel James, once said, a husband serves and loves his wife because she is he. But let me give you context before you react. They're one flesh. The rib God took out has been reinserted, and they are now one person. Therefore, you are not to look at the time, energy, and attention you lavish on her as being directed towards someone else. She is he, so the best thing you can do is love her. She is he in the true sense. So the best thing you can do is to love her, dear brothers, because you are a one flesh union, and you are actually investing not just in her, but you blessing yourself. As one author said, nothing is more determinative of the peace, the stability, and the spiritual progress of a home than a husband's loving leadership. Maybe read that again. Nothing is more determinative of the peace, the stability, and spiritual progress of a home than a husband's loving leadership. And I'm talking here of the loving leadership of Ephesians 5:25. Raising kids. How many of you have kids that's still in the home? Wow. That's cool. A pastor once said to me, Anton, there's nothing more instrumental and determinative of their relationship with the Lord than your relationship with your wife. That's how they see the fruit of what you believe. That's how you impact them. Don't think you're going to talk about Jesus and lead them to Christ separate from your relationship with your wife. And you might at this point ask, Anton, when are you going to talk to my wife? You know, this has been 2 sessions of just giving us her time. But again, there's nothing more determinative of the peace and the stability and the spiritual progress of the home than your love for your wife. And I saw that in practical application. We just got married, and I was clueless and selfish. My wife was sweet. No, she was clueless and selfish too. She was a brat. No, honestly. And we would get into an argument. I would get in the car. It's like, we're going to see our pastor. Knock on the door. Oh, you again. And he would sit us down, and I would tell him everything she did wrong. She did this wrong. I was like, yep. And he would like, yeah, that's terrible. Mariki, you got to stop doing that. And then he lectures me for like 45 minutes. I'm like, what's wrong with this picture? You got to talk to her, not to me. She's the problem, not me. But he always told me, Anton, you like the thermostat in the house. The way you love her will really set the temperature for the home. And that is why I'm hard on you guys. You have such an impact on everything, husbands. God has called you to lead. God has called you to love. Your love is to be like that of Christ's, right? He loved us first. He did not wait for us to love him. So, coming up is session 2. How did session 1 go last night in your little retreat? Was that cool? Any tears? Come on, time of confession. There's always somebody who cries, right? There's always. Last year, out in Alabama, we actually had one couple who was ready to go home. They like, it's done. And we're like, just chill. You paid for this. Don't run off. And this guy, after the weekend, he wrote his pastor, he says, next to me coming to the Lord and being baptized, this has been the most impactful thing in my life. Because really, that conversation with his wife was revealing of how he's actually loving her. Somehow when we look at ourselves as to how we love our wives, it's like a carnival mirror, right? If you get the angle right at a carnival mirror, right, you can lose like 6 pounds. I can look really good in those carnival mirrors, but that's how we look at ourselves, husbands. We look at we love her great until we start chatting. And this is what we're going to do this morning. We're going to dig into a little bit of conversation with our wives in terms of how are we doing in terms of loving her. And I'm making a little more emphasis on the spiritual side. Because that's often where I say husbands do a great job in providing food and clothing and whatever the wife needs. Husbands, generally, Christian husbands are pretty good at taking care of their wives in a physical sense. But when it comes to the spiritual side, I see a bit of a famine there. So this is going to help you. Just reflect. You're going to find some areas that you feel like, I'm not doing good at that. Knee-jerk would be defend, right? Explain away. Just listen. Ask more questions. Take notes. And if you have time left, turn it around. Let the wives ask you some questions, husbands. And then we'll get back together again after this. And I know you are excited to go hang out with your friends, but just take this time, spend with your wives, and we will come back at what time, Charles? 10:45. So you got just on an hour to spend time with your wife. Okay? Let me pray for you. Heavenly Father, we ask that you will just give us all the grace we need to talk, speak the truth in love. Pray, God, that you will calm our hearts and that we will receive, if indeed some correction, maybe even some admonition and correction. Lord, humble us, man. Pray for our wives to be gentle and careful with their words. But Lord, do a work here. Make good marriages great here this weekend. In Jesus' name, amen.